Nothing was crossed, and yet everything shifted. No boundary was violated, no obvious danger appeared, nothing dramatic happened. And yet, something inside the nervous system began organizing differently. At first, you simply become better with people, better at reading a room, better at noticing subtle changes, better at sensing what someone needs before they say it, more observant, more emotionally precise. And most people see that as strength, because it is. In many ways, it is exactly what allows you to do this work well. But there's another side to that adaptation, a side that's much harder to see. Because at some point, you stop simply being with people, and you start reading them automatically. You notice tone changes before words fully land. You feel shifts in energy almost immediately. You track facial expressions without consciously deciding to. You anticipate reactions before they happen. And eventually, you become so skilled at this that other people experience it as intuition, as emotional intelligence, as being exceptionally good with people. But internally, something else may be happening. Your nervous system may no longer be relaxing inside connection. It may be scanning inside it. And the difficult part is that by the time this becomes noticeable, it often feels completely normal. Because it has been happening for so long, you don't experience it as effort. You experience it as awareness. You don't experience it as monitoring. You experience it as being attentive. You don't experience it as hyper-vigilance. You experience it as being good at your job. This episode is about what happens when anticipation becomes automatic. When the nervous system learns that being one step ahead feels safer than being fully present. And how over time that adaptation can quickly begin organizing intimacy itself. Welcome at the Psychologist for Escorts podcast. I'm Eva Valora, and if you do this work or have done it, this is a space built specifically for you and for what you carry, for what you navigate, and for what you deserve to understand about yourself. In the previous episodes of this season, we looked at how containment forms, what it costs the body to maintain it, and how long enough containment begins reorganizing the relationship between feeling and expression. This episode goes one layer further into what happens when the body doesn't only contain emotion, but begins scanning for the conditions that require it, when anticipation becomes the default, and how that anticipation can quietly begin organizing not just professional encounters, but intimacy itself. In high-end escorting, hyper-vigilance rarely develops because of one specific event. It develops through repetition. The nervous system learns through patterns. And over time, certain patterns occur often enough that the body begins expecting them before they arrive. One of the clearest examples in this way many women learn to enter a room. There's a specific kind of attention that develops when you regularly enter a private space with someone you have never met before. A hotel room, an apartment, somewhere that exists outside ordinary social accountability. Not fear exactly, a particular quality of preparedness. The scan is not about danger in the conventional sense. It's about reading the full relational context before it fully declares itself. That kind of rapid, complete environmental reading, practiced enough times, doesn't stay at the threshold. It becomes the way you enter every room. Because inside this work, your ability to accurately read people matters. Not occasionally, consistently. You're entering encounters with people you have never met before. People with different personalities, different emotional needs, different attachment styles, different expectations, different ways of expressing disappointment, desire, loneliness, insecurity, or entitlement. And because every interaction unfolds differently, part of the job becomes learning to recognize subtle changes as early as possible. You learn to read those changes quickly, because detecting them quickly allows you to respond effectively. And effective responses often create the kind of experience clients want to return to. So gradually, the nervous system learns something important. The faster I detect changes, the easier it becomes to manage what happens next. And that lesson gets reinforced multiple times within a single work encounter. Not because everyone consciously teaches it, because experience teaches it. The body begins collecting evidence. Every subtle cue becomes information. Every facial expression, every hesitation, every shift in energy gets registered. And eventually, the nervous system starts gathering information automatically. This is where containment and hypervigilance begin overlapping. Because containment already asks the system to hold emotion carefully, to regulate expression, to stay composed, to keep your inner experience contained. Hypervigilance adds something else. Monitoring, prediction, anticipation. The body is no longer only regulating itself. It's simultaneously tracking the environment, tracking the other person, tracking what may happen next. And importantly, this is not necessarily experienced as anxiety. Many women imagine hypervigilance as feeling frightened, on edge, nervous. But often it feels nothing like that. Often it feels competent, professional, attuned, present, capable. Which is exactly why it can remain invisible for so long. Because the adaptation works. It helps you navigate complexity. It helps you manage uncertainty. It helps you avoid friction. It helps you create experience that feels smooth and effortless to others. But the nervous system pays for that effort, even when nobody sees it. Because every moment spent monitoring is a moment the body is not fully resting. Every moment spent anticipating keeps part of the system active, prepared, available, ready. And over time, the nervous system can begin associating intimacy itself with management. Not because intimacy is dangerous, but because intimacy has repeatedly been the place where management was required. That shift is worth pausing on, because for most people, intimacy is not something that has to be carefully managed. It's something that can simply be experienced. But within high-end escorting, when intimacy and management have been paired long enough, they stop feeling like opposites. They begin feeling like the same thing. And the body stops moving towards closeness as somewhere it can simply be present. It moves toward closeness the way it moves toward everything else that has repeatedly required attention. Ready. And this is where things become psychologically interesting, because by the time this becomes noticeable, it no longer feels like vigilance. It feels like awareness. It feels like caring. It feels like being good at your work. But presence and anticipation are not the same thing. Presence allows the nervous system to rest inside a moment. Anticipation keeps it one step ahead of the moment, always preparing for what hasn't happened yet, always ready for what might come next. You don't experience it as scanning, you experience it as sensing what people need. But a nervous system that's always one step ahead is never fully here. That pattern is called hyper-vigilance. And the moment most women hear that word, they reject it. Because hyper-vigilance sounds like anxiety, like fear, like expecting something bad to happen. That's different. Inside high-end escorting, hyper-vigilance often developed through a different pathway. Not through panic, through adaptation. The nervous system learns that accuracy matters, that noticing things early matters, that being one step ahead matters. And when a skill repeatedly creates smoother outcomes, the nervous system strengthens it. That's how learning works. That's how adaptation works. Over time, the body begins trying to reduce uncertainty before uncertainty arrives. Not consciously, automatically. Part of the nervous system remains focused on prediction, on mood, on behavior, on emotional shifts, on needs before they are expressed. Because the earlier something is noticed, the easier it becomes to respond. The goal is not control, the goal is preparation. Because preparation feels safer than surprise. And this is where something important happens. The body slowly starts organizing around anticipation rather than presence. Not because presence is impossible, but because anticipation becomes more practiced, more familiar, more rewarded. Imagine sitting with a client. The conversation is pleasant, nothing is wrong, nothing is happening. And yet, part of your attention may still be tracking. How engaged is he? Has his mood changed? Is he becoming attached? Is he withdrawing? Is he disappointed? Does he need reassurance? Does he want more emotional closeness? Does he want less? How is the atmosphere shifting? Most of this happens beneath conscious awareness. You aren't sitting there actively analyzing. You simply know. You feel it. You notice it. And because it happens so quickly, it feels like intuition. In the work, your visibility is carefully managed. What you show, what you withhold, what version of yourself is present. All of it is deliberate. And over time, that deliberateness can reverse itself in an unexpected way. you become highly attuned to what other people are managing about their own visibility. You notice what they are choosing not to show, what they are protecting, what they want you to believe about them, and you receive it professionally. You don't push into it, you don't make it visible, you don't let them know you have seen it. That skill stays. In personal relationships, it means you often know more about someone than they realize you know. But underneath intuition, the nervous system is processing an enormous amount of information, continuously, quietly, automatically. This becomes especially important inside intimacy, because intimacy naturally contains uncertainty. Every human interaction does. But intimacy contains more of it, more emotional exposure, more physical proximity, more attachment signals, more subtle interpersonal information. And when intimacy repeatedly overlaps with emotional labor, the nervous system learns that closeness requires monitoring. Not because closeness is dangerous, because closeness has repeatedly been the environment where regulation was necessary. The nervous system doesn't separate these experiences the way the conscious mind does. The conscious mind may say, "This is work," but the nervous system is paying attention to something else. It notices repeated proximity, repeated touch, repeated emotional attunement, repeated regulation, repeated management, repeated monitoring, repeated anticipation. And over time, those repetitions begin shaping expectation. The body starts assuming, when intimacy appears, I need to become more alert. Not dramatically, subtly, just enough to stay prepared, just enough to stay responsive, just enough to stay ahead. And eventually, that preparation can become so familiar that the absence of preparation feels unfamiliar. Moments of complete relaxation begin to feel strange. Not because the body wants stress, because the body has become accustomed to readiness. It has practiced readiness thousands of times. Readiness becomes the default setting. This is why some women notice something confusing. They may deeply want closeness, deeply want connection, deeply want intimacy. And yet, when intimacy appears, their body doesn't fully soften into it. Part of the system remains active, still reading, still tracking, still monitoring, still anticipating. Not because they don't trust the other person, not because something is wrong, but because the nervous system learned that intimacy is a place where attention matters. And what is repeated often enough eventually becomes automatic. The important thing to understand is that hypervigilance is not the problem. The nervous system is doing exactly what it was trained to do. The challenge emerges when the system loses flexibility, when monitoring becomes the default response to all closeness, when anticipation becomes more familiar than presence, when scanning becomes easier than relaxing. Because eventually the body begins bringing the same preparedness into places where it's no longer required. Into friendship, into relationships, into affection, into love. And that is when an adaptation that once created safety can slowly begin limiting rest and intimacy. Not because the nervous system failed, because it succeeded a little too well. So, what does this actually look like? Not in theory, not in psychological textbooks, but inside everyday life, inside your body, inside your relationships, inside moments that are supposed to feel simple. You may notice that you rarely stop reading people, even when there's no reason to. You walk into a room and immediately know who feels comfortable, who feels nervous, who wants attention, who is holding something back, who is disappointed, who wants approval, who wants control. You notice these things before anyone says a word. And most of the time, you don't even know how you know. You just do. You may notice that your attention is constantly moving outward, tracking, monitoring, reading, interpreting. Not because you consciously decide to, because your nervous system automatically gathers information. The room gets scanned before your body settles. The atmosphere gets evaluated before you fully relax. The emotional environment gets mapped before you become present inside it. You may notice that you often know how other people are feeling before you know how you are feeling. You notice their tension, their discomfort, their uncertainty, their emotional state, almost instantly. But when someone asks, "How are you?" you sometimes need a moment, because your attention has spent so much time tracking outward that noticing inward requires an adjustment. And that adjustment is not always quick. Sometimes someone asks you how you are, genuinely, with care, and you notice a small delay before anything arrives. Not because you are withholding, because the direction of attention has to shift. The system has to turn from reading the room to reading itself. And for a nervous system that has spent years moving outward, inward is a less practiced direction. Some women describe this as feeling slightly foreign to themselves in those moments. Not estranged, not distressed, just further away than the person sitting across from them. You may also notice something else, that intimacy can feel surprisingly effortful. Not always, not dramatically, subtly. The body remains slightly active, slightly attentive, slightly prepared, even when you genuinely enjoy the person's company, even when you feel safe and want to be there, even when you are sexually aroused. Part of the system continues working, continues monitoring, continues reading, continues anticipating. Sometimes you find yourself noticing tiny changes that other people completely miss. A shift in breathing, a hesitation before a sentence, a change in tone, a micro-expression, a fleeting look of disappointment. Signals that most people would never consciously register. But your nervous system notices them immediately, and often you automatically adapt to them before you have even realized you have done it. You may find that being around people feels more tiring than it should. Not because you dislike people, not because you are antisocial, but because your nervous system is doing far more work than is visible from the outside. The interaction may look effortless. The regulation happening underneath it is not. And perhaps one of the most confusing experiences is this. People often admire the adaptation. They tell you how intuitive you are, how emotionally intelligent you are, how perceptive you are, how calming you are, how incredibly good you are with people. And they aren't wrong. Those qualities are real. The sensitivity is real, the awareness is real, the skill is real. But what they often can't see is the amount of nervous system activity underneath those abilities. Because every gift has a mechanism. And the mechanism underneath hypervigilance is constant attention. And nowhere is that more visible than in a very specific dynamic that many women recognize from the work itself. Like the particular dynamic that develops when a client begins to fall in love with you. What began as a transaction starts carrying emotional weight for him. He develops expectations. He begins to believe the warmth is personal. He starts to need more than the encounter itself. And you have to manage that. Not by withdrawing, that loses him. Not by reciprocating, that creates a different problem. But by staying warm enough that he feels seen, while remaining unreachable enough that the attachment stays contained. That's an extraordinary, precise psychological skill. Warmth without availability, presence without accessibility. And like every skill that is practiced often enough, it stops being something you do, it becomes something you are. In personal relationships, the people who love you sometimes feel it without being able to name it. They experience the warmth, and they also experience the distance underneath it. What they cannot feel is what it costs you to hold both simultaneously. You yourself may notice that complete relaxation around another person feels rare. Not impossible, just rare. There's often a subtle readiness still present, a subtle alertness, a subtle awareness of what's happening around you, as though part of the system remains on duty, even when nothing needs to be managed, even when nobody expects anything from you, even when love is present. And perhaps the deepest recognition is this. You may realize that you have become so accustomed to monitoring that monitoring no longer feels like monitoring. It simply feels like you. It feels like awareness. It feels like attentiveness. It feels like emotional intelligence. It feels like personality. And that's precisely why this adaptation can remain invisible for so long. Because when a nervous system practices something thousands of times, it eventually stops feeling like something you do. It starts feeling like who you are. And if some part of this feels familiar, if you recognize the constant reading, the subtle anticipation, the inability to completely stop tracking the emotional environment, then let that recognition be information. Not judgment, not self-criticism, simply information. Because awareness is where understanding begins. And understanding is what allows the nervous system to discover that closeness doesn't always require vigilance. Nothing we have described is dysfunction. Hypervigilance often develops from competence, not incapacity, from becoming exceptionally skilled at navigating complex emotional environments, from learning to notice what matters, from learning to anticipate what helps. Your nervous system didn't become hypervigilant because it was broken. It became hypervigilant because it learned. Because learning is what nervous systems do. And the foundation of that learning is something worth naming. Sensitivity. The ability to perceive what others miss. To notice what has not yet been spoken. To detect subtle changes before they fully emerge. That's not the problem. In many ways, sensitivity is one of the reasons you have been able to navigate this work so effectively. The challenge begins when sensitivity no longer remains a skill, when it becomes the nervous system's automatic way of entering every interaction, when awareness stops feeling like choice and starts feeling like the only way to be. The goal is not to become less aware. The goal is not to become less sensitive. The goal is regaining choice. Being able to notice without automatically monitoring. Being able to perceive without constantly preparing. Being able to remain aware without the nervous system assuming that every interaction requires the same level of vigilance. Because the nervous system doesn't relearn safety through understanding alone. It relearns safety through experience, through repeated moments where you let vigilance soften without anything demanding its return. Through repeated moments where the body discovers, I don't have to monitor everything. I don't have to stay one step ahead. I can simply be here too. Because ultimately, healing is the return of flexibility, the ability to move between attentiveness and ease, between perception and presence, between awareness and rest. And when that flexibility returns, intimacy slowly stops feeling like something that must be managed and start feeling like something that can simply be experienced. So, if you recognize yourself in what we have explored today, the automatic scanning, the constant monitoring, the way your attention immediately moves toward the emotional environment, the way part of you is always reading, always noticing, always anticipating, let that recognition be information. Not judgment, not criticism, simply information. Because during your work, your nervous system learned a particular strategy. And what it learned can become flexible again. The goal is not to become less perceptive. The goal is to become free, to choose when perception is needed and when it's not. Because there's a difference between awareness and living on guard. A difference between being present and being prepared. And in the next episode, we are going to explore what happens when these adaptations become so familiar that they stop feeling like strategies altogether. When containment, hypervigilance, self-control, and emotional management begin organizing identity itself. I'm Eva Valora. This was episode 4 of season 2 of the Psychologist for Escorts podcast. What lives inside you deserves your attention. Give it a moment before you move on.